Flights around Moscow airport have been diverted following a Ukrainian drone attack. Just how is this part of Ukraine's new drone strategy? Plus, is Putin relying on child labor to build its Shahed drones? Why can't he find any military-age males to work in his factories? It's a mystery no one can solve. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Okay, so this I thought was really interesting because we've seen several times throughout the conflict, Ukraine launch drone attacks into Moscow. And one of the things that has stopped them up until this point is that in a lot of cases, the Ukrainians don't want to risk the ire of their allies in the West by escalating the conflict. And this has been a red line, particularly for the United States. And it's frustrated the Ukrainians, I think, for a long time because it's seen that Vladimir Putin can send thousands of drones, hundreds of drones a night into Kiev and other major cities. But the U.S. says as a condition of aid and support, you can't return the favor. And obviously, it is considered some level of war crime to target civilian facilities. But again, if there are military facilities within a certain metro area, then those become acceptable targets. And the fact that Moscow is the seat of government of the Russian Federation can make targets within Moscow metro area a target. And if Moscow airport is facilitating military flights, which is actually very, very common. If you've ever been in the United States, you see a lot of particularly Air National Guard bases operating out of major airports simply for the sake of efficiency. Then that makes those airports legitimate targets as well. But why did the Ukrainians go out and throw a wave of drones, reportedly up to 100. The Russian Ministry of Defense says that its air defenses took down 93 Ukrainian drones, including 19 over Moscow and 16 en route to Moscow. Later in the day, the Defense Ministry said they actually downed an additional 8 drones over Moscow, 5 of which were allegedly en route. So, of course, Russian Telegram channels, the only reliable source of news at this point for the average Russian, said that a fire broke out in some of the cities northwest of central Moscow, and there is indeed social media appearing to show vehicles burning near a residential building. Now, it's not clear if these burning vehicles were directly associated with the drone at all. They could simply be, poorly made Russian cars. Sometimes you get those cars with propane tanks in the back to power them. But the most notable effect, right, is that one, this is the 4th straight night that the Russian capital has been targeted by Ukrainian long-range drones, and the Ukrainians likely are using this as an effort to inflict exactly what they did do, which is, for example, the cessation of flights and the diversion of flights around Moscow. And this itself is not. That may seem like an ancillary military function, right? It may be something that just sort of happened to have occurred. But in fact, I think it's closer to the core objective. And the core objective of this is to tell the populations of Moscow, St. Petersburg, these are oligarchs, these are urban, well-connected, wealthy Russians, that, hey, this war is coming home to you too, right? And as we've talked about, historically, populations that are subject to this kind of bombing in their home areas actually tend to galvanize against the war. But again, would this be the case? Let's say if North Vietnam was somehow able to trigger explosions in places like, I don't know, Seattle or DC or New York, would the U.S. public at that time, at the peak of the anti-war movement, would they have viewed those actions as being galvanizing of, hey, we have to defeat the North Vietnamese, or would they view it as saying, listen, this is so pointless, and now this war is targeting us? It's tough to say for sure, but I think if nothing else, Russia's oligarchs, who, again, depend on these kind of airports to fly their private jets, they at least are seeing more and more that the war feels closer and closer, both spiritually as their assets are being seized, as their businesses become less profitable, as the coercions that Putin demands become greater and greater. But they also physically say, man, I could have been targeted. My planes, me, my family could have been hit by this. And perhaps they'll start to say, hey, This is something we have to put a stop to. Now, before we talk about the fact that the United States and Russia are both manufacturing their own version of the Shaheds, and more importantly, why Russia is depending on teenagers to do it, I want to mention two things. The first is that to the average Ukrainian at the front lines, Shaheds and deep strike drones aren't actually the biggest problem. The biggest problem is fiber optic drones. That's why I'm working with Ukraine Aid Ops, and we have been raising money to buy all the defensive tools these guys in the East need. And what are they asking for? Well, they're asking for their own fiber optic reconnaissance drones to find Russian positions. They're asking for collimators to make their shotguns into anti-drone firearms. And of course, they're asking for quad bikes to improve their mobility. We talked to one unit, the one I think with the 22nd, who said that if they can't get their hands on these bikes, the only other alternative to get supplies into positions is to walk 10 kilometers, 6 miles from positions through drone-infested areas, right? So the ability to cover the same dense terrain, but do so, turn a 2-hour walk into a 30-minute drive, makes them way less likely to get detected. And of course, camouflage, and of course, netting. You can see literally there's a drone caught in the netting. So if you want to help these guys out, of course, they have a bunch of perks for us, including patches. But shout out to everybody who has stepped up for these guys. Yeah, you can, of course, donate anonymously, but if you want to leave a message, you can. Thanks to James. Those who ignore the lessons of history are doomed to repeat them. Right? Dan, Paul, Casper von Schendel, Atem Mork Offendal. These have some crazy names. It's pretty gangster. For the love of our Western way of life, Travis Wagner, Ryan Hesse, Kenneth. Shout out to all you guys for stepping up for these guys. And of course, if you want to step up for me and get access to uncensored combat footage sent often straight to me from the front lines, I just got another video from one of my contacts there that's going to drop on Tuesday. If you want to support me, this is the best way to do it. combatvetnews.com. The reason it's so good is that it is entirely run and hosted by me and the team. So literally, you guys becoming members, that goes straight to keeping the team in operation here. So if you want to become a member, get access to those members-only videos. They're every Tuesday and Thursday they drop. There's always stuff YouTube would never let me show you. Absolutely, sometimes unbelievably wild combat footage. But it gives us the insight into the front line that we just can't get anywhere else. So a link to all of those are in the description. Okay, so here's what I wanted to talk about. First off, Russia, right, is recently dropped a propaganda video showing what it calls its Garand factories. And the Garand, of course, is a Russian clone of a Iranian Shahed, right? For a while, Russia was buying Shahed drones and sort of experimenting with them. They found that they were actually very effective, or they believe they're very effective. And so now they've said, listen, let's make more of these things in-house to circumvent sanctions. This is in Russia's Yelabuga production facility. This is a special economic zone. Basically, it's common with a lot of autocratic governments that say, listen, we want to basically take existing laws and constraints around how you can start a business and how you can employ people and how you can manufacture them. And we're going to create a zone where the rules are looser and laxer so that we can create these kind of high-tech production hubs. And so what's most interesting is that the people working there are teenagers. Teenagers are reportedly invited to work in the Garand plant after finishing 9th grade, just 15 years old, and come from a nearby technical college. The Russians brag. They say everywhere you look, there's young people working here. They're not young people, they're teenagers, they're children. They're children working in a munitions factory, one that is known to be targeted, right? This is a valid military target. It is a weapons factory. Right? Shahed drones are instrumental in Putin's plans, of course, but this, I think, is the most troubling thing, right? Other footage, of course, that the Russians dropped showed a Garand being launched from the back of a Dodge Ram 1500, a pickup, seemingly in violation of sanctions, right? Right. And of course, the video claimed that this plant's production lines include metal foundries and a blacksmith workshop and stations and testing facilities, and basically tried to argue that much of the Garands were being manufactured in-house. And given that the up to 500 of these drones are fired at Ukraine in any given night, and up to 1,000 in a single day, analyst estimates that that these Garans are probably that Russia's producing something like 18,000 every 6 months. You also, of course, have the cost, which can get as low as $20,000 a unit. But the real takeaway, again, is that Russia's trying to spin this extreme negative as an extreme positive, literally taking kids, diverting them away from their education and making them screwdriver operators in a weapons factory, one that is a legitimate military target and at times has been targeted by the Ukrainians, should be disturbing to like the average Russian. But the fact that they can't employ other people, you might recall that for a time there was a scheme to actually import African workers into recruit them to work in these factories. But that got exposed and was kind of backfired. And part of the reason, I think, is because politically it looks really bad. Because remember, Russia has two conflicting problems right now. It has a high inflation rate, but it also has a labor shortage, right? And if you have somehow this high inflation rate and this stumbling economy and a shortage of people that actually do the work, it's very difficult to justify bringing in foreign labor to do jobs. Because remember, inflation rate's high. A lot of businesses are stumbling and there's still a shortage of labor. If you're like economically, Paul, that doesn't make any sense. Yeah, correct. Well, it makes sense, but only if you realize that the Russian economy has become this incredibly warped animal where essentially it is a war economy that is sucking up. You have to think, war does an economically weird thing because it sucks up people and stuff and destroys them. It's an economic black hole, right? And normally, if I build a factory in Russia, that factory will sell a product or service that has economic value, right? But what is the economic value of a Garan? It gets sold maybe to the government and then gets thrown at the Ukrainians, but that isn't necessarily the sort of investment in growing an economy, right? The way if let's say I made computers in the United States. Well, a business buys them and then the business becomes more efficient and effective, right? And then in turn, whatever that business makes becomes cheaper or better. And that becomes a virtuous cycle, right? War just becomes a black hole in an economy. And this black hole is so big that it starts to do things that are difficult to make sense of. Literally, no matter how much you pay someone, you're never going to bring back those million dead Russians. That's why they have to employ these teenagers. But also in the civilian sector, there's a huge labor. There is a lot of unemployment because if you are a Russian who bakes bread, the sanctions have meant that you can't get the materials you need, and there's not as many people to buy them because, well, a lot of them are dead. So you have these weird distortions that result in, of course, teenagers who should be watching anime and talking to girls are instead making weapons of war. But the one thing no one can argue with is that they're effective. And this I thought was also really interesting because the U.S. has actually debuted what they call the Lucas, which is their answer to a Iranian Shahed 136, right? And the United States claims it's a budget-friendly combat drone competing directly with Iran's Shahed 136. And this is from the AP, but you can see it's debuted at some kind of garden press event. It's touted as a low-cost, uncrewed combat attack system. The system, of course, meets all the constraints for and integrates with U.S. systems. It does a lot of the things that become so problematic, right? The Lucas integrates with a mesh network that's been debuted that's going to be rolled out by the U.S. military and its partners. It has the ability to sort of have a modular package. You can drop in, turn it into a reconnaissance package or a strike package. But what's most interesting is, again, the Lucas claims it can be produced for as little as $30,000, depending on the configuration. And this is huge because one of the things that I always point out, it's one of the things that I really appreciate. Again, I'm a critic of the administration when they do dumb shit. And when they do smart shit, I'm not a critic. And this is an instance, I think, of them doing smart shit. The reason is because the U.S. military for so long, its entire acquisitions pipeline has to think about the war 10 or 15 years in the future. The problem is, in order to do that, you make your best guess about what the war of the future is going to look like. And in some ways, the U.S. military was spot on. If you look at a Ukrainian ground drone, it looks a lot like some of the U.S. ground drones that we've been designing for 15 years. But sometimes the U.S. gets it way wrong. And the idea of a ultra cheap, low cost, attritable deep strike munition was just not something the U.S. forecasted. The U.S. thought that deep strike capabilities would be the domain of stealth fighters like the F-35 and F-22. The problem is the cost of a Shahed drone. It is like if you were to strike a target with an F-35, the cost per flight hour of the F-35, like if you flew it for 2 hours, you could buy like 15 Shaheds or Garans. So the fact that this math works is something the U.S. never anticipated. And so the U.S. has to say, listen, it doesn't matter if 10 years down the line, we're going to have a superior piece of technology, because you don't fight the war 10 years in the future. You fight the war today. And if you don't have an army that can win today's war, then you literally won't be around to field the weapons of the future. And so the fact that the U.S. is saying, listen, we're not too proud to admit we need to have our own Shahed. But the company that made it, this I thought was so funny, okay? The company that made it literally doesn't even have this on its website. Instead, look at what they have. This is clearly the same airframe, but it's called the FLM-136. And what is it? The FLM is an emulation. It is a Shahed clone, literally. They've said, listen, we built a Shahed. It is an authentic threat emulation. This is to train, they manufacture this to train U.S. air defenses to hit Iranian and Iranian Shaheds, Russian Garans. So when they saw that the government actually wanted their own version, they said, well, we already make them. So why don't we just tweak them a little bit, the thing we already make that the government already buys, right? Our fake simulated Shahed, and let's just make it a real Shahed. Let's stick a real payload on there. And we will roll it out as the Lucas. And, you know, the truth is that I think this is an illustration of the fact that sometimes we forget that the U.S. military actually has so many resources, and this like quasi free market contractor competition world can actually be pretty effective. Because again, imagine if there was an actual combat situation where the U.S. said, no, we need our version of the Shahed, we need our version of the Garand, like tonight. Like we need to be hitting strategic targets over the Strait of over the Strait of Hormuz. No, the Strait of Formosa, right? Like we need to be hitting Chinese military targets on the Chinese side of Taiwan. Well, the U.S. would say, this company would go, listen, we already manufacture Shaheds. Give us 2 weeks and we'll have it ready. We'll have your own Shaheds ready to be produced. So, it's a reminder that the U.S. has an economy something like 10 or 15 times the size of Russia. And reportedly, again, the Lucas is a $100,000 system. But if you have a system that's cost even 3 times as much being produced by an economy that's 10 times as rich, guess what? It is a steal, okay? And compare that to the price of, say, a U.S. Tomahawk missile, which is probably between $5 million. You're looking at one Tomahawk missile strike, or you could launch literally, let's say it's $5 million. That's what 500 Lucases. So it's a no-brainer. But Russia, of course, according to at least one German general, Russia is bragging about its Shahed production capabilities because, well, it's going to be able, it hopes, to launch up to 2,000 drones towards Ukraine simultaneously. This is from the Ukraine task force at the German Defense Ministry. And you can see here, total drones launched by month by Russia. And you can literally see in real time as Russia exponentially increases their drone production capability, or at least their strategic drone production capability. right? And of course, this is validated by Robert Magyar Bravidi, commander of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, saying that Shahed strikes could escalate to up to 1,000 per day. And remember, when they're being shot down by things like Patriot missile batteries, which cost, where the missiles cost, millions each, you're talking about a real mismatch. And Russia really believes that it can run potentially the world out of Patriot missiles by launching these kind of strategic drone strikes. But generally, we've heard Patriot missiles are reserved for cruise missiles because the Ukrainians actually are trying to counter Russian drones with their own kind of tech. They use some jamming that the Russians supposedly have done a pretty good job of counteracting, but they also are relying on their own interceptors. Increasingly, they're building their own short-range, like mini Garans that while the Russian Garand is, let's say, $30,000, these are small Ukrainian interceptors that are like $3,000. That their only job is to talk to the radar and zip in and hit the Garand and take it out, usually within just a couple miles. So the potential, and of course you have conventional air defenses that just sort of shoot down the Garands in kind of the old school way. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Thank you to Peter Fucci, Dan M. Petratore, Henry Russo, Scott Call, Chris Rossi, Al90, Sergey Nachenko, D. Stewart, James Porsche, B. Hemmerling, all of our Lieutenant tier members. Hit that subscribe button. I appreciate each and every one of you guys so much, and I will catch you in the next one. Cheers.